Good morning. Welcome to RBC Disruptors. I'm John Stackhouse, host of our ongoing conversation about disruption, innovation, and how technology is changing everything around us. If you're watching on Facebook Live or WebEx or listening to our podcast, thanks for being part of the conversation. Today, we're joined by Sam Sebastian, the CEO of Pelmorex, the company behind the Weather Network. And Sam's a leader in Canadian innovation in his own right, as you'll learn a bit more about today. If you don't know Pelmorex, you're probably a user, and you're going to learn more about that today. It is the world's third largest weather platform, I believe, and Canada's fourth most actively used app, so something we're all turning to. And if you're thinking about the weather outside today and the storm that is hitting us, you may think that we're going to be talking a lot about the weather today. So a bit of a spoiler alert, we're not, because Pelmorex is way more interesting than the weather.
Just go to the Weather Network app and check your
yes, boost those numbers. Before joining Pelmorex, Sam was head of Google Canada here in Toronto, and moved to Toronto in 2014, which is when we first met. And it's remarkable how much the data economy has changed over the last 6 years. Just a couple of numbers or data points to think about. According to Statistics Canada, the data economy may now be worth more than $200 billion in Canada. Just to put that into context, all the oil reserves that we know we have in Canada are worth maybe $300 billion. So data really is the new oil. But it's also an epic challenge for all of us in Canadian business, because to be frank, there's a number of platforms out there that, I'm thinking of Google and Amazon and Facebook, that are kind of the OPEC of the data economy. And they control a lot of the supply of data. Great companies, but there's an equal challenge to everyone else in the data economy. And questions about how we use data to become more relevant to customers. That's something we're asking ourselves a lot. How do we use data to ensure we're actually building public trust, that we're not eroding public trust? How do we use data to be more efficient in everything we do? And I think one of the critical questions is, how do we think about and use data to improve our impact in our communities and in the world around us? So terrific opportunities as well as challenges that we're going to be talking about over the next hour. But Sam, welcome to RBC Disruptors.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
We like to kick off our conversations with what we call snappers, quick questions just to get the conversation going. So I'm going to actually turn to the weather, because I can't resist. Is there a most popular time of day that people turn to their weather app?
Well, as you would expect, morning. So in Canada, Eastern time, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. We're also the largest weather player. Pelmorex owns the Weather Network and Meteo Media and El Tiempo and a few other weather brands around the world. And so on the Weather Network and Meteo Media, 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern is typically the highest usage time. In Spain, folks tend to come on around 7:45, 8 in the morning, kind of plan their day around the weather conditions. In Spain, it's typically sunny. It's a little different here in Canada. So we have a few more users in Canada than in Spain, but not.
And is there one destination or place that tends to be off the charts?
Toronto and Montreal are our two largest destinations. Calgary is number 3. It really is, based on users. We have close to 35 million users duplicated across all of our platforms, whether it's television, app, mobile web, or desktop web. So we're pretty much wherever any Canadian is.
Now, I didn't mention this in the intro, but Sam is an extraordinary tennis player and leader in the tennis community here in Canada. I've heard you still are. He was a 4-time state champion in Ohio, which is where he grew up. Played for the Ohio State Buckeyes, led them to a Big Ten championship, and was an academic All-American. So I can't resist a few snappers on tennis. So Roger or Rafa?
Neither. Felix, Dennis from Canada, and Milos.
Venus or Serena?
Neither. Bianca.
Okay, I'm going to corner you. Milos or Bianca?
Listen, I'll answer. So Milos inspired Bianca and Felix and Dennis, and he was the first one to get to a Grand Slam final from a singles perspective, and I think inspired a lot of young Canadians. And then Bianca delivered our first Grand Slam title. So we've got the world covered.
Milos or Bianca? So I should point out, Sam and his family moved here 6 years ago. They're now permanent residents. They've applied for Canadian citizenship. And the way you've kind of dodged the question, Sam, I think makes you a Canadian. So yeah, welcome to the family. That was well done.
Yeah.
So let's start with a look at the state of data in 2020. Canadians invest something like $40 billion a year now in data. It's more than we spend on machinery and heavy equipment. So it is a significant driver to the Canadian economy. And yet, firms that have looked at our usage of data, especially from a business perspective, I'm thinking of the report McKinsey did for the Business Council of Canada, found that most Canadian companies have not moved beyond kind of elementary data analytics. Deloitte studied even the leaders in Canada and said, against your global peers, you're not where the rest of the world is. So I wonder, Sam, you've got great fresh eyes still coming into our country. You've seen the data economy through Google and now through Pelmorex. What's holding Canadians back?
So I'm going to take a slightly different tone to this. I'm American and recently Canadian. I've found that Americans tend to pound their chest and say how great they are. Canadians tend to sulk and say how not great we are. And so I'm going to answer the question with kind of some positive optimism and momentum, because I actually, in the 6 years I've been here, when I first started at Google running Canada, there was a sense and a stereotype that Canadian business was very slow on digital transformation, data. In the 3 or 4 years I ran Google Canada, and the last 2.5 years running Pelmorex, I've seen more momentum in the clients that I worked with at Google and the peers that I now have at Pelmorex and in the tech community than in any other previous time in Canada. So I do think we have to look to leaders in the U.S., in China, in other leading countries across the world for kind of inspiration and scale on what can be done from a data and AI machine learning perspective. But at the same time, I do think we can look inward, especially from our startup community, Kitchener-Waterloo, Vancouver, Ottawa, Montreal, downtown Toronto. There's significant ambition and entrepreneurialism and smarts in this country. This is kind of this is the birthplace of AI and machine learning in many ways. And so I think this is a great time and a place to continue to invest and move forward in Canada. And so I try to strike a bit more optimistic tone, because I think big corporates and definitely entrepreneurs and startups understand both the challenge and the opportunity of data, analytics, artificial intelligence, and especially in Toronto, we're attracting more of that type of talent and employing more of that type of employment here in Toronto than almost any other major city around the world. So I think it's a great time. I think we still have a lot more work to do, but we're definitely trending in the right direction.
So talent is key to data. We'll get into your talent strategy and more of the Pelmorex story, but I want to stick with the question or the idea, the line of thinking about where Canada is right now. So if we are taking off as you suggest, that's terrific. Also, a lot of concerns, competing interests in how we approach data. The federal government is working on a new data strategy, which would be very helpful, probably for everyone who is engaged with data. I want to get your high-level thoughts on what we need to get right as we think about our approach.
I think we have to be careful from a regulation perspective. About 10% of our business is in Spain, so there was a privacy legislation framework that was launched a couple years ago called GDPR, and so we needed to be compliant for that. And my personal opinion is much of that framework was put in place in order to kind of curb the continued momentum of the big tech giants like Google and Facebook in Europe. I think the opposite happened. It actually had an unintended consequence of making Google and Facebook even stronger, because a lot of the regulation was pretty onerous, it was pretty complex, there was a lot of work you had to do to be compliant, and so a small, medium-sized business or someone kind of just struggling to compete with larger players has trouble kind of managing in that type of environment, where when I was at Google...
Just because of the regulatory burden.
Exactly. When I was at Google, we had hundreds of people preparing for that 2 years in advance. And when I moved over to Pelmorex, we just started putting a plan together. We threw some bodies at it, and we were probably further ahead than many other digital publishers and websites across Spain and Europe. So I think you just have to be very careful. I've talked in Ottawa a bunch about this. I work on the data charter from the Business Council, and I think it has to be a balance of a principles-based approach to say these are key things that if we do right, accountability, transparency, protection, a user-first, user-minded approach to regulation, to not restrict a user's ability to have a great experience on the web, to protect critical PII, personally identifiable information. Those principles are critical, but do it in a way that does not is not so onerous that it actually hurts our ability to compete. Secondly, I actually think this is a huge opportunity for Canada. Whenever I'm in Europe, our sales team trots me out, and all they say in prep for a customer meeting is just smile and say you're from Canada. And that will calm them all down, and we'll say, yeah, we're a very trusted company and we're large and we're part of a larger conglomerate, but we're based in Canada, so you can trust us. That is especially in light of kind of how things have played out the last 5 or 6 years down south in the US, we have an unbelievable reputation on a global stage. And if we can get our privacy framework right so that we use it as an opportunity and allow us to be competitive across the globe, most of corporate Canada now and even startups aren't just trying to build a company in Canada and thrive in Canada. They have global aspirations. And so it really can be a differentiator if we do it right, and privacy can be an opportunity that I think can create global champions, but we have to get that balance right between over-regulation, too much onerous kind of compliance with and be very principles-based.
So be principles-based, probably with more enforcement, which has kind of been the
for sure.
Canadian approach.
Agreed.
But is it that simple?
Well, it's not simple, for sure. But I don't necessarily know if governments are the answer. And a regulatory framework is always the answer. I do think, listen, maybe this is some of my Americanism coming through, but I do think that in the end, we're a great example. So we have 60 million users that come to our platforms on a monthly basis. The minute that we upset the apple cart of trust with our users that we've built over 31 years with our brands, the Weather Network, Meteo Media, El Tiempo in Spain, Clima in Spanish-speaking Latin America, O Tempo in Portugal, the minute we upset that balance, boom, we're gone. That's by far our most important asset as a company, is the user trust we have with 60 million users. Our average user comes to our app 22 times a month. So that is loyalty and connectedness that we've got. And so we have to get it right as a company. Regardless of whatever the regulatory framework is, we have to ensure that we have accountability, we have transparency, we give a user the opportunity to opt in and opt out. We're as upfront as we possibly can be, because there's so many choices out there now. Someone will go somewhere else if they feel like they're being bait and switched.
So let's get deeper into the Pelmorex story. First of all, the name.
Our founder is a great entrepreneur, Order of Canada, Pierre L. Morissette, Pelmorex. Enough said. It's a private company, and he's building a great legacy, and has built a great legacy. He was the founder and the CEO of the company for 31 years. He was actually my first customer meeting, my first customer visit when I came up here to run Google Canada. We struck a great personal and professional relationship, and after about 2 or 3 years of having a kind of a partner relationship, he said, listen, I'm 72, 73, 74 years old. I'm looking to step back. We want this company to be a multi-generational family enterprise over the course of the next 100 years, but I need someone who has many of your skill sets. We have the same value set, but I need someone who knows digital, who knows data, who's global, who, we need to get into the US, et cetera. So you're the perfect guy to run this company. Are you interested? And after about a year or so of talking, I had been at Google for 12 years, and it was the perfect time to make a change. And it's been 2.5 years, and it's been fantastic. So he's still the executive chairman of the business, but he founded the company, Pierre L. Morissette. And then we have brands that you would recognize: the Weather Network, Meteo Media here in Canada, and we're the major weather player here, and we're the third largest in the world.
Yeah, no, it's such an inspired move on both sides. As I mentioned in the introduction, you're the fourth most used app in Canada, I think, behind Facebook, Google, and Apple. Curious how a weather channel, essentially an old media company that Pierre created back in the 1980s, transitioned. What was the most critical factors in that transition to being a dominant player in the mobile space?
The entrepreneurial DNA of Pierre and the company. So, and this is what I grew up, I was 12 years at Google, so that was, I naturally, organically just felt, when I started at Google, we were 7,500 employees. When I left, we were 110,000. So you grow up in that environment, it's just very natural. Many traditional media companies don't have that DNA, but Pierre, being an entrepreneur, had it and was always growth-minded. So as soon as he recognized the power of the internet, even though he knew it may cannibalize his television audience, he could see around the corner and recognize, okay, well, this is even a better platform for me to deliver an hourly, 3-day, 14-day forecast to our users, and gives me an opportunity even to strike a deeper level of engagement. So, he launched one of the first websites in the country, and then one of the first apps, one of the first interactive television platforms, et cetera, just because that was his nature. And then the business kind of built up around that DNA. And then now we're most all of any new employees that we're bringing in are data scientists, full stack developers, engineers, because that's what we'll need to continue to manage through disruption that's been just kind of a natural for us to respond to in the last 31 years.
So all of us who use your app know the data that we're looking for. What kind of data is most valuable to you or to the company?
Well, our core product is forecast. So weather data, we basically have 3 chunks of data. The first is weather data. And so we take in probably between 15 and 20 weather models from around the world, free and paid weather models. We put them into I'm not a technologist, so I'll use simple language because I'm a simple man. Put them into a machine, we mix them all up, we throw a bunch of artificial intelligence, machine learning inside the machine, and then we develop our own bias blend forecast that takes the best of all of those models and our 30 years of history of knowing how best those models work. So that's the science behind it. And then we have 45 meteorologists inside the company who sit on top of that data in our forecast center and then tweak it for the art that goes along with the science of weather to create the forecast. So because that's our core product, weather data is probably our most valuable asset. It's also a bit of a commodity because you can get weather data from all over the world, but if you treat it, I think, like we do, and you put a lot of care and feeding on top of it, you'll wind up differentiating your forecast in a more accurate, engaging way than almost anyone else. So weather data is extremely important, and it's becoming more and more important as we develop new products, which I can talk about in a little bit. Second is just the behavioral data of our users in an anonymized, aggregated fashion that use our sites. So again, we've got 55 million users, probably about 40 to 45 million on the digital side. So we have a sense of what they're doing on our sites, what they're doing across the web, and that gives us an opportunity to build audiences that are very attractive for advertisers. And about 75% of our revenue model is advertising based, so that's important. And then over the last couple of years,
so that just means knowing where people are, knowing where I am when I'm searching for.
Not physically. That's the third part, but it's basically your kind of the what you're looking for. where you've traversed around the web and our site, what types of searches you've done on the weather network, and then we can kind of put you in audiences that then become very valuable to advertisers to kind of target an overall audience group to make it a very relevant experience for when you're on our site. And the last bit of data is location data. So this is an opportunity, but also a big challenge that we take extremely seriously. So when we have about 8 million users who use our app in Canada on a monthly basis, and we'll ask you when you download the app, would you like us to follow you while you're using the app, or even when you're not using the app, because we'll send you dedicated forecasts, safety alerts whenever. We also manage the backbone for the emergency alerting system for the country. So anytime there's an Amber Alert or a wildfire alert or a tornado alert, we'll send those to you as well. As well as, if I'm traveling to Montreal, you were in Ottawa yesterday, we would send you a dedicated alert saying, watch out for 40 centimeters of snow in Ottawa today. So we have a really good value exchange where we'll ask a user, are you cool with that? If you're cool with that, we may, on an anonymized and aggregated basis, use that location for some interesting products that we'll build inside the organization, and as well perhaps leverage for building more of those audiences from an advertising perspective. So that's kind of the 3 buckets of data that we have. And on top of all of these, especially the behavioral and location, is what I talked about before, is kind of the seriousness that we put and the bar that we set for privacy, for accountability, for transparency. Because if we don't have that, and we built such a strong brand in Canada over 31 years, then all this other stuff doesn't really matter.
So I want to get to some of the products you're developing using all this data, but you've touched a couple of times on this point about terms and conditions, which is one of the greatest challenges for all of us wrestling with data questions. I think I read the Facebook T&C is 14,000 words. I don't know if anyone here has actually read it. Probably no one has.
Ours is 1,942 words, our privacy policy.
1942.
The Weather Channel's is 5,114. AccuWeather's is 4,000. So to your point,
so how did you get to?
I figured that's probably where you're going. All the research we've done on our users is, if you tell them what you're doing, why you're doing it, you give them the ability to contribute, opt in, opt out, and you treat them with a great deal of respect, and you outline in advance what you want to do. For the most part, if you built that trust, they'll let you do it. Or they'll say, no, I'm not comfortable with that, that's fine. You just have to communicate. And you have to communicate in a way that is pretty straightforward. So that was the goal of our privacy policy. We basically, if you look, if you go to our privacy policy, we'll have a 1 or 2 page executive summary, or 1 page that just says, here's what we collect, here's why we collect it, if you don't like it, here's how you opt out. Boom. So you don't have to go any further if you don't want to, but then we go through all the other stuff that you kind of have to go through. But we try to keep it very straightforward, very folksy, very engaging, very kind of English, because you can get, or French, because you can get lost in a lot of the T's and C's that really don't make sense, and you're just going to click OK. Because location information and location tracking is a thing that we want to be very cautious with, we launched a 3-minute video that explained everything that we do, why, and how you can opt out if you elect to. We put that on the front page of our app, and it's still there. So we always just want to tell our users what we're doing and why, and for the most part, users are cool with it. I mean, that's the value exchange. Now, why a certain app might ask for your location information, and if the value exchange is not clear, then I could understand why you might say, well, you're a sports app, why do you need to know exactly where I'm going all the time? But from a weather perspective, it makes all the sense in the world. Now, the challenge is on us to continue to develop great products to answer that value exchange, and that's what we're obsessed with. So that we can develop products like weather on your route for a day like today. I'm from Oakville, so I was trying to map out exactly how early I had to get here so that you wouldn't get upset at me. And those are the types of products that, again, answer the value exchange, because we can give that information back to a user in an exchange. You give us a little bit of information. And then if done right and anonymized, aggregated with all the right compliance. We don't collect any personally identifiable information. It's just not our business. Then you can perhaps build some interesting new products from that, build some new businesses, and continue to grow the business. But you have to be very careful about both the value exchange and the relationship with your most important asset, which is the end user.
And when you simplified your TNCs, is there no one, was the response rate different? Do users react differently?
I don't know. Frankly, I don't think users read them.
So whether it's 2,000 words or 12,000 words.
But I use that because we focused on it. It was very specific to say, you know what, let's just be very straightforward with our users. I was more concerned about building a 2-minute video that explained even more plainly, here's why we use location data in case you have concerns, and then we got lots of uptick on that. So that's just generally what we constantly try to do.
But I think it's really important to your brand and that intangible relationship in the in cyberspace when you are honest, upfront, transparent, and clear with people. Whether they read the TNCs or not, they're just going to trust you more and have a different
especially
different
like we've got one of the most important public-private partnerships in the country in the form of managing the technical backbone of the emergency alert system. So that's one of probably one of our top 3 or 4 assets as well that we're extremely proud of. And so, but that has to be right on our brand of safety, of security, of backup, of all of those kind of things because lives are at stake. And so that carries over into our core business as well.
How do you organize yourself as a business to strategize and activate all that you're doing with data? I mean, it's amazing. Pelmorex is what, 600 employees?
400.
Sorry, 400.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. 60 million users globally through 400 employees.
We are superhuman. Superhuman.
How do you organize yourself to
it's a combination of a couple things. So the core business, with respect to the weather information I was talking about, our forecasting, that is just in our core operation. So over time, we've hired R&D and scientists in meteorology who have this wicked combination of engineering and a Met background. It's hard to find that combination that will sit in our core business and ensure that we have all the right machinery in that data, weather data machine I talked about. But as over the last 2 or 3 years, as we've identified ways to build businesses around both weather data, behavioral data, and location data, we basically formed a startup inside the company. Pelmorex Data Solutions was the name of the subsidiary, and it's basically a 40-person startup inside the company that operates on an entirely different model for the most part. They work crazy hours. A lot of them don't wear shoes. I'm kind of being funny, but they're just these young creatives that just grew up with data science and data engineering as kind of in their bloodstream, and we can attract those folks. And then if you have the right leadership on top of them without like KPIs around how much money you're going to make, what's the ROI, but just with KPIs around what's a new experiment we can do, let's understand if this adds value to our users, how can we perhaps create new businesses in the right way over time, leveraging data. You'd be amazed how much can happen with a team like that. And then acquisitions that we've done subsequently, we might focus and target in that type of area. So we bought a company right when I first started in Liberty Village, Addictive Mobility, because they have a great set of ad tech and products that we want to add to our assets, but they also had 5 killer data scientists, a bunch of engineers. They had a downtown location, and so it really helped us begin to build the venue and the environment to kind of create some new businesses that weren't as mature and kind of work more from an operational perspective to keep the lights on, make sure our users are happy. This has to operate at a different speed, different KPIs, and frankly, even different talent in order to make it work. So we've kind of balanced those two.
Going back to the data solutions unit, what's your thinking strategically, and the give and take in your mind between having that as an independent unit, a startup within the company, versus integrating it through the business units?
I don't think there was another way to do it, again, because they work on a different clock. Now, sometimes it gets hard and gets frustrating because you'll have a team that is working, a startup life is very different than a 30-year-old broadcast company or even a 10-year-old app and website company. And so they just work on a different time clock. And so sometimes they'll be there at 9 o'clock trying to deal with something that came up that is totally new because we've never been in the business, and they'll watch their peers leaving the office at 6 o'clock because that's just the nature of kind of the mature operation. And so we have to, but they sit in the same building. So how do we kind of manage some of those incentives and things like that? But otherwise, I think, and it's worked for us so far, kind of putting a bit of a silo around that organization and letting them just fly and not get caught up. Even in a 400-person organization, we have bureaucracy and rules and all that nonsense. And so keeping them sheltered away from that so that they can just fly. Now, we have to be careful because we have this core asset and all this trust. So the connection points are around things like privacy by design. So we just got certified privacy by design, which basically requires you to build privacy business requirements into every new product that you build. And we felt that was extremely important for our core business for the reasons I've described earlier, but even more important for these new data businesses, because in their effort to launch cool stuff, they may, cut a few corners from a privacy perspective, and we don't want that. We want to ensure that the standards that we set in our core business, we also maintain and sustain in a lot of these new businesses that have to, run at the speed of light.
And how do you balance culturally the lawyers who probably keep their shoes on? And the data geeks who may be barefoot.
In the end,
they're both good people, but driven by different
correct
different issues.
We did put a ping pong table in that part of the office.
Sorry, in the lawyers?
No. The lawyers they never leave their office. It kind of comes down to just the technology. This is what I learned at Google that I'm trying to apply at Pelmorex. The reason folks came to work at Google was not the bean bags and the games and frankly even the money. It was working on the coolest technology and building products that would be seen by 1 billion users. And knowing that when you came into the company, there would be a level of autonomy and empowerment that would allow an entry-level person or a first-year data engineer out of University of Waterloo to create a feature that would be seen by 1 billion people. That's our pitch to the co-op from the University of Waterloo to come work for Pelmorex. It's not any of the other stuff around, and that's what jazzes them, is I want to work on cool AI technology. I want to work with folks that think like me and that will challenge me, and I want to have an impact on a large scale of users where I can actually see my stuff in front of users. That's what we found drives them. So we just try to set up that capability in those venues to attract and retain that type of talent.
That's such a great insight. You've been talking about the products that you're building on the backs of data. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more and give us some insight in terms of what you're building, but how you go about building products and ultimately monetizing.
Yeah, some of the new things that we're really excited about is on the weather side. So we've had this instinct, and it's much more than instinct because we're a weather business, so we can see it in our numbers, that on a day like today, our traffic to our website will increase by about 25 to 30%. It has a massive impact on our business. Now, we're a weather business, so that's obvious. Every other business in the world now is collecting much more data about what makes them tick, what drives sales, and building their own data cube. Weather is a huge variable in many businesses around the world. And so, but the problem is a lot of these businesses, especially small to medium businesses, don't have the data scientists, the analytical firepower to be able to create those correlations and understand them. So we've been in the process of building what we call a Weather Insights platform that basically goes to could be one of our existing advertising customers and says, give us sales data for the last 5 or 6 years for all your locations in Canada. This could be a quick serve restaurant. We will mash that up with the historical weather data in all of those locations, and build through an AI algorithm, understand the correlation between product sales, footfall traffic into your stores, et cetera, and weather. And that's extremely valuable because it tells you the impact that weather has had on your business. But what's most valuable, our core product, is an hourly, 3-day, 5-day, 14-day forecast that we're remarkably good at. We've gotten better over time. I know we get it wrong sometimes, and you let us know, please continue. But for the most part, we get it right. And so then we can help a quick serve restaurant tell the future, because we know the correlation of a product sale on weather. Oh, and by the way, for this location in Calgary over the next 14 days, here's the weather conditions, and we know the correlation of this one variable. There's probably 16 crazy variables in weather that have a real statistically significant impact on product sales, and we can tell you the blend of those variables over time, and then you can make decisions accordingly. So I think that's just, and this has been in place for a very long time, but businesses just didn't, they would always just look at last year's comps for that particular location and say, okay, well, this is what I think I'll do this week when I factor in a couple of other things. Now, because they're just much more minded around analytics, and weather tends to be a pretty big component, they're just more interested in these types of insights. And we've got the talent, because we've had to build the talent for our own purposes, to do that on behalf of businesses. And if we can do it in a platform with a couple of easy buttons that says, okay, what is the correlation? What is the impact on my business? We think it's a huge opportunity.
So you've got a great depth of knowledge, a deep vertical through weather, not just today, but longitudinal data that the platforms may not have. But they've got a breadth. They see us behaving in all sorts of different ways that you might not get a glimpse of. So it's an interesting juxtaposition there. Curious about your thinking on how you manage to go up against the platforms, who are presumably also thinking about these opportunities. They're trying to reach the same retailers, provide the same or similar insights to help them. Of course, they're much bigger. So how do you balance
so
that?
there's a couple ways to answer the question. The first is the relationship with the user. So over time, Google, Facebook to a certain extent, when you go into Google and type in what's the weather in Toronto, they'll show a little one box at the top that says here's the 5-day forecast, a bunch of little suns or something like that, and they'll answer perhaps a very quick query. That may take a little bit of traffic away from us and engagement on the weather network, but where we're pretty darn confident is on days like today. So I don't think a user is going to go to Google on a day like today to understand exactly what's going on in Toronto, how I have to plan my day, because they want to go to someone who's all over it. And that's us. And if you go to our website, or our app, today on days like this, we go into something called Storm Center, where we pull in all the best of all of our content, all of our on-camera personalities, all of our Twitter feeds, our storm hunters. We've got 4 million followers on all of our social networks, and we bring them all in, and we basically go 24-hour, all hands on deck on days like this. Google won't do that. Facebook won't do that. It's not necessary for them. They focus on scale and super large problems. And so that's why I think it's not a moat around our business by any means, but I think it's just, in the last 2.5 years that I've been at Pelmorex, that's been the strategy, is to go deep on what we do best, which is the weather. And that can be our differentiation. If we try to compete with Google and Facebook up here, we won't. They're too big, and they can develop a very quick interaction and level of engagement with the user and a consumer. But if you want to go deep and you want to know exactly what's going to happen over the course of the next 14 days and plan your life accordingly around weather, there's not a better place to go than us. And we just have to continue to build the products that meet that promise.
So go deep on what you know best. That's a great business insight. Presumably, you also have to think about balancing that or amplifying that with global scale. You're dominant in Canada, dominant in Spain, have an interesting presence and growing presence in the US, South America. Yep. How are you thinking about global scale?
So it's a top priority for us. We're looking to grow in two ways. Number one is globally, to diversify our business geographically, as well as to go from we're mostly a B2C type of business, so we have all these users and monetize for advertising, and now build more B2B products like that Weather Insights platform I suggested. And from a global expansion, our strategy is, I think, a little bit different than a few other companies around the world in this space, where we believe in a local team, a local brand that understands the local fabric of the community and the market that we're in. So when we wanted to go into Spain, we found a market-leading company. We bought them, and we've grown them. When we bought them, there were 5 or 6 employees. It was a relatively small operation. There's not a lot of weather in Spain, so they can operate like that. Now we're 45 folks. It's 10% of our business and continues to grow. But it grows behind a local team based in Madrid, based in Barcelona. El Tiempo is the brand. And we've done the same in Meteo Media in French in Montreal. We do the same in English-speaking Canada behind the Weather Network. We launched a Latin America brand, Spanish-speaking Latin America brand called Clima. So that's kind of the goal, is to launch with specific brands that are very connected to the communities that we serve, and either build them or buy into various different markets that make sense. It's also been interesting. In the last 2 years, we've got 2 million users in India. We didn't even try. It just kind of happened. And so now we've got a development effort focused on, okay, how can we deliver more value, better products to that massive market, and go in there and begin to build our business there too. So we'll use some of our own analytics to determine where folks are actually connecting with us outside of our core markets, and then perhaps either through acquisition or build, go into those markets. We do watch out though for competition. So the 2 largest players in the weather space are the Weather Channel and AccuWeather, who dominate the US. It might not make sense for us to go into the US and compete in that pretty competitive ocean. So we're really mindful of how we do that.
It's such an interesting insight on the India experience, because one of the powers of data for any business or entrepreneur is that it can take you to markets and opportunities that you didn't think about. And you've got to be open to sort of listening and watching your audience via data. So it'd be great to see what happens with the India experience.
Agree.
For you. On this idea, though, of global expansion, that then leads to a question about cross-border data flows, which we're all wrestling with, and presumably your company has to wrestle with.
A little. We don't have, because we don't have PII or credit card information or anything like that. There's less onerous regulation and concern about cross-border data flows. We do focus on. If you're in a market and you download the app from that particular country, we're very careful to make sure we're following all the right regulations within that country, and especially around location and behavioral information and consent and all that kind of stuff. So we're very careful there. But other than that, for the most part, because you don't have a lot of that more sensitive information, it's less of an issue on kind of how data flows than maybe a bank or an insurance company, et cetera.
But a lot of people were thinking about where the data conversation is going to go in the 2020s are increasingly concerned about the so-called splinter net and division of regulations. You mentioned GDPR, but just different standards and enforcement in different jurisdictions. And maybe I can draw on a question we've got from one of our Facebook viewers about the enforcement of PIPEDA, the Canadian privacy legislation about to celebrate its 20th birthday. That's how long it's been since we've updated our privacy legislation here. And if it's enforced in a similar manner to GDPR, given your experience and what we might draw from.
Yeah, I think so. I was talking to some folks about this earlier this week in a roundtable, and I do think the government is going to hopefully take PIPEDA and build on top of it, as opposed to scrap it and start over and do something new. Because I do think the principles based of that regulation has been really good for the country. I really do. I think it's differentiated us from around the world. So if we can build on top of that and build some teeth and enforcement in it, I think that's the right thing to do. And then we just have to kind of be fair and balanced on how you enforce. But you also have to be clear on the definition of data. So, and then maybe begin to prioritize it. This is where sometimes I get a little nervous about going too crazy on hardcore enforcement around advertising data. I would be more focused on ensuring that companies banks, insurance companies, other folks have all the enforcement in place to ensure that cyber attacks and hacks and all those things are locked down, because that is what really can cause a lot of chaos, as opposed to a user getting a more targeted ad as they go across the internet. And so I think as I've kind of dug into this over the last couple of years, the definition of data and putting a scope around what are you actually trying to solve and why, and who are you trying to protect is going to be extremely important. Otherwise, you wind up almost creating too much chaos where there's not clarity, and then everyone's not exactly, I mean, this is kind of what happened with Castle. No one was exactly sure
That's the anti-spam legislation.
Anti-spam on what they were allowed to do, what they weren't allowed to do, because there wasn't clarity and definition and scope around the actual regulation and enforcement.
So a lot of it comes down to the idea of preferences, and all of our preferences are different. That's the nature of humanity. And there was the celebrated case in Canada. It was actually through Google, where someone was served up a healthcare ad related to their condition that they had been searching, and there was an argument that this was a violation of their privacy. Maybe not with respect to that particular case, but cases like that, many people would say, well, that's my preference. I actually would like that kind of information in the form of an ad or other content. Given that it is so individualistic and sometimes idiosyncratic, how can we think about and balance that individual preference with also a desire for privacy?
Well, I mean, we're in the process of doing this. You see this a little bit with CCPA in the US, the California legislation. If you can give the opportunity to a user to opt in and almost set their preferences of what they want to see, then you begin to get there. Now that, if you
some of us don't know what we want to see or don't want to see until we see it.
Agree. And the other part about this is if you do it state by state in the US and then you do it country by country, it gets a little obnoxious, especially when you're trying to build a global business. So I get that. But I think we do have to be careful that we don't go so far this way that, like right now, the beauty of the internet, in my opinion, this is just a personal opinion, is I don't have to pay for a darn thing. I get a chance to go and travel all over the web, all over the world, do a ton of research, read, all that stuff. And for the most part, with the exception of a couple subscriptions that I might have, I do that for free. And the value exchange is, I know I'm going to see some advertising along the way, but I'm using the internet for free. I mean, we employ 50 meteorologists to deliver the best forecast. We don't charge for folks who go to our app or our website, but we do advertise, and that's how we actually pay for the service. I think that's a good thing. I also think when you're traversing the internet to get an actual targeted relevant ad at the right time that might be relevant for you as you're traversing the web is not a bad thing. 50 years ago, you'd be watching television, you would get an ad that would have absolutely that made no sense for you to be seeing. I don't want to go back there. I just don't think it's smart. So that's, I think, the balance that we have to strike. We don't want to be creepy. We got to make sure that we've got the safeguards in place so that we're kind of protecting folks' privacy, but at the same time, I don't think we want to go back to the Stone Ages where 50% of your advertising might work, you just don't know exactly which 50%.
You said something quite interesting and maybe provocative, that a lot of this depends on our definition of data. And I think about that when we get into conversations about the right to be forgotten, which of course sounds great. Many of us want to be forgotten on some days, and probably people around some of us want us to be forgotten too on some days. But there's dangers in that, because I may search for weather and maybe I don't want you to know, or I decide, you know what, I don't want people or anyone to know that last week I was searching for this place. But it's gone into your data systems and has created metadata, anonymized presumably, that is of value to you, but to others. And there may not even be the ability to retract it or to eliminate it, but maybe I don't have the right to eliminate it through the system, especially up to a meta level. How should we be thinking about sort of our desire to control or maybe even own our data, which could be idealistic, but many people want to own their data, versus the reality of layered data in cyberspace?
This is over my pay grade, so I don't know if I'm going to give the best, most.
You're the CEO, Sam.
Yeah, but right to be forgotten is not, that's not necessarily our business for the most part, because what's a little different from us is we don't really know all that much about our users. We don't require registration. You don't log in when you come to our website. We don't have that information. So what we do is we have generalized, anonymized, aggregated information about clumps of people, which becomes really valuable for us from an advertising perspective and from an insights perspective, but we can't pinpoint down to an individual person. And so it's less relevant for a business like us. It was very relevant when I was at Google, but it was always a slippery slope. And I want to be careful I don't speak for Google, and I'll get myself in trouble, although I can't get myself fired from there anymore. That's also a slippery slope. If someone, and Facebook's contending with this as well on accurate depictions of social posts, et cetera. I do think that if someone, if there's factual information on the internet and Google surfaces it, I don't think you have the right to be forgotten in that context. There's factual information, and if you did something wrong in the past but you just don't like the way it was portrayed, I don't think you as a user have a right to kind of take that off of the internet. And in many ways, Google is the entree to that. Now, if there's not factual information and Google hasn't done the work to determine that that's the case, or in the case of YouTube where you've got offensive videos that they haven't done a good job vetting and all those types of things, that's where Google and Facebook, I think, have the responsibility to staff up to ensure that those don't happen. But for those cases that are actually accurate, I think that's part of the world that we live in. So that's the one element of right to be forgotten that I know was kind of in the crosshairs a couple years ago, and still is, because in Europe you actually do have that right, and Google has to take a lot of these things down in many instances, and sometimes it's gray on whether or not someone should or not.
And on the commercial side of the conversation, how should we be thinking about data ownership? Who should own data ultimately?
I think, there are some folks that feel that ultimately a user owns all of the data and they should be compensated for it. And in some ways, depending on the nature of that data, maybe there are business models that are associated with that might make sense. I would argue that from an internet perspective, like I mentioned before, in many ways, the value exchange of delivering free content and in exchange being advertised to, that is to a certain extent a commercial relationship that kind of works. Again, it can't go over the line, it can't be creepy, and you do have the opportunity to kind of opt in or opt out. But where this goes, I don't know. There may be opportunities where you can have your own little digital wallet of all your types of kind of personal information that you can kind of sell to various different services over time and be compensated as a user. Lots of folks are kind of advocating for that. I think that will be hard to see how that kind of scales up. But if a company adds a lot of value to a set of data, I do think they have an opportunity to build a business and be compensated based on that, as long as they balance and constantly communicating with the user on what they're doing, why they're doing it, and giving the user the ability to opt in or opt out.
Do you think we're going to get to anytime soon a model where if you're monetizing my data, helping that retailer, and they're presumably paying for you, that maybe I'm going to get a share of that via the blockchain or some other system? I know there's theories and lots of ideas around this, but is that something that we're likely to get to?
I don't think it's around the corner. Personally, but I just think there are too many. I just think that's going to get super complicated how you're going to track that. Now, maybe you can through blockchain technology over time, but I would say that's 5, 10, 15 years away, and I don't know how. When you add all that up, what maybe a user makes $6 a year or something like that. I don't know what the value of those particular atomized units are over the population of the web universe.
I wonder, just as we move towards close, if you can share some thoughts about trust. You've talked about all that you're doing to build trust with users. And there's a general view out there. The Business Council of Canada is issuing a report today called Data Dividend, that identifies public trust as a big concern in Canada. 75%, 3/4 of Canadians had their data compromised in some way last year. Is this a serious concern, or are we overblowing it? And how should we be thinking about it?
I think it's a serious concern. 100% think it's a serious concern, especially around the sensitive, personally identifiable information. I think is critical that organizations get that right. If you've got my credit card, if you've got my SIN number, if you've got my social security number in the U.S., if you understand, even my email, that is sensitive to me, and I want to ensure that the folks that I work with have the policies and the technology in place to ensure that gets used for only the right reasons. It's encrypted, it's anonymized, and there's no way to kind of backward configure and figure it out. That, I think, makes a ton of sense and needs a lot more investment, because every time we get better at that, the kind of the negative side of society and the hackers get even better, and they're one step ahead. Where sometimes I feel like we can go a little overboard is on some of the things I talked about before, where let's ensure that we don't go backwards from a advertising perspective, meaning I would prefer in my own navigation of the web to have a relevant experience that's relatively frictionless, as opposed to having to opt into every website I want to use, make decisions everywhere, and then wind up having, you know, some lottery ad or something that makes no sense to me, or a monkey going like this. These were the first display ads 35 years ago, 25 years ago. I fear that we might go back that way, and it's a bit more spray and pray and has no real impact on me as an individual user.
Well, in that classic Canadian way, hopefully we'll find a middle ground that balances those. I wonder if I can finish with two closing questions on different topics. One, you're known for your growth mindset. I'm just curious what you've come across, book or anything you've heard or listened to or seen in the last number of months that's added to that.
The CEO of Disney just retired. He's now the executive chairman, Bob Iger, and I just read his book. I saw him at a conference speak, and I thought it was extremely impressive. And there were many parallels in continuing to reinvent ourselves at Pelmorex, and how Disney has reinvented themselves. And Bob Iger was the architect for a lot of this recent reinvention. And so I found that book remarkable, and I would highly recommend it. And even more interesting now that he's kind of stepping back. He wanted to step back as CEO 2 or 3 years ago, but they did some massive acquisitions, and he stayed on board. But now finally he's going to get his life back and step back.
Was there a particular Iger insight that you found most valuable?
I think it was mostly just just never resting. I mean, Disney is an unbelievable company that continued to have huge influence and emphasis on society, but they never rested. They were always trying to go and get more content and deliver a great experience to their users. They just had to do it in different ways, right? They had to create the kind of their own Netflix type product. They had to continue to make sure they had the best possible content that worked well within their flywheel, and so they were comfortable buying Lucasfilms and other things. I just thought that was it was extremely strategic on how he thought about navigating a super disruptive world and pushing them forward, and so far it's worked.
Great. And the second question I wanted to leave with is, we make a donation, a charitable donation on behalf of all our guests, and Sam picked Tennis Canada. So wondering if you can share a few words on what Tennis Canada means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the board of Tennis Canada for about 3 years, and it's just been a super rewarding experience. The mission of the purpose or the vision of Tennis Canada is to be a world-class leading tennis nation. And in the past, we hadn't necessarily been that way. And about 10 or 15 years ago, Tennis Canada changed their strategy, devoted the small number of resources they had to building high-performance capabilities, academies. They went out and hired the best coach, Louis Borfiga, to run the operation. And Bianca, Felix, these are products of that machine. And it's, again, like a flywheel. If you can inspire young players and anyone to get out on the tennis court based on the success of these great champions, it has got an exponential impact. Tennis participation in Canada over the last 2 years is up 36%. The problem we have in Canada is there's 7,500 tennis courts in Canada. 10% are indoor. and accessible. They're not private clubs. This is a cold country. In order to be reasonably good at tennis, you have to play year-round. And we only have 750 accessible covered courts. That's one for every 50,000 folks in Canada. A typical country in Europe is 1 to every 2,000, 1 to every 4,000, 1 to every 6,000. So if our goal is to get more and more Canadians outside, enjoying the game of tennis, being healthy and well, we have to solve some things like this in order to allow folks to get out there. And so all the success that Felix and Bianca are having gets more folks kind of connecting with the game. Our Rogers Cup is a major funding source, and this allows us to create awareness to get more of those covered courts and get more folks out playing the game of tennis, which I think has a huge impact on the country. So I just love the opportunity to participate.
What a great cause, and love your conviction, but thank you for your commitment to that. Sam, I want to thank you so much for your time today and being part of RBC Disruptors and sharing really valuable insights on the challenges as well as the opportunities in the data economy. And to our audience, both here and online, thank you for being part of the conversation. If you're a podcast junkie, like all of us, please subscribe to RBC Disruptors wherever you get your podcasts. We're releasing new episodes more frequently now. And stay tuned for future events. You can do that by going to rbc.com/disruptors. Thank you all for being here. Thank you again, Sam.
Thank you.
Fantastic.